Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Hexham Heads. Introduction. In the early 1970s, Hexham was a quiet Northumbrian market town, a place of ordinary lives in old stone cottages. Families went about their routine, under grey skies, never suspecting that something buried in a suburban garden would soon stir up ancient echoes and uncanny tales. It began on a calm afternoon at number 3 Rede Avenue, an unremarkable semi-detached house on a sleepy street. Two young brothers were at play in the back garden, blissfully unaware that they were about to unearth a mystery that would intertwine their ordinary family with folklore and fear. Colin and Leslie Robson, aged 11 and 7 respectively, had only just moved into 3 Rede Avenue with their family a couple of weeks before. The Robsons were a down-to-earth family. Their mother, Jenny Robson, kept a tidy home and watched over the kids while their father worked long hours. Little did they know what strange vigil she'd soon keep. The boys had an older sister, Wendy, who by fate's timing was away on her honeymoon when all this began. On this particular day in 1971, with spring bringing a break in the rain, Colin and Leslie entertained themselves in the garden by doing a bit of weeding and roughhousing in the dirt. In their boisterous play, they tossed clumps of soil and stone at each other, laughing as only carefree children do. Suddenly, Colin's fingers closed around something odd beneath the soil. What he pulled from the earth was unlike any ordinary rock. It was a small carved head about the size of a boy's fist. Intrigued, Leslie rushed over from where he'd been watching from an upstairs window and immediately began scratching through the dirt nearby. In an almost miraculous symmetry, he too unearthed a second stone head, only a few feet away. Each brother now held a grotesque little face in his hand. They were roughly spherical, about 6 centimeters across, tennis ball sized, some would later say. The material was a greenish gray stone that glittered with tiny quartz crystals when held to the light. The crude features had been laboriously etched into the hard material. One head appeared male, with stripes across the crown, suggesting hair combed straight back. Its round eyes were white set, and a long nose gave it a friendly, open expression. The other head had a far more severe countenance, a witch-like face with a strong, beaked nose and wildly bulging eyes that lent it a sinister air. Over time, people would come to nickname the pair the boy and the witch, or sometimes the hag, based on these features. Standing there in the garden, perhaps the boys felt a tremor of excitement, a sense that they'd found buried treasure. Colin and Leslie had no way of knowing whether these peculiar objects were ancient relics or just someone's lost trinkets. But they were curious and proud of their find. Laughing and shouting for their mother, they ran inside to show off the stone heads. Jenny Robson indulged her boys' excitement, examining the dirt-caked faces with a smile of curiosity. Like many mothers in that practical town, Jenny likely assumed the heads were a harmless curiosity, maybe old good luck charms or pieces from a long-forgotten game. She wiped the grime from the grotesque little dolls' heads and set them on the mantelpiece, unaware that this simple act was the first step in a chain of events that would nearly upend her family's peace. That night, the household at 3 Rede Avenue went to bed with the two heads quietly adorning the living room. Outside, the wind may have whispered through the hedges, but indoors, all was still. The Robsons could not have guessed that these strange stone faces might carry any sort of energy or curse. But by the next morning, small signs of mischief had begun. Jenny entered the living room with a load of laundry and paused. The heads, which she was sure had been left facing the room, were now inexplicably turned towards the window, as if gazing back out at the garden patch from which they'd emerged. No one in the family admitted to touching them during the night. It was a small oddity, easily brushed off with a chuckle, or blame tossed at one of the kids. But it was only the beginning. Chapter 1. Strange Happenings at Number 3 Rede Avenue. Over the following days, the Robson household was beset by a series of bizarre disturbances that escalated from uncanny to outright terrifying. At first, it was little things. A door left ajar, objects not where they had been left. Once, Jenny found the heads moved again from their spot. It seemed no matter how she positioned them, by morning they had subtly reoriented. Those little stone faces peering out towards the garden with uncanny consistency. The children started whispering that the heads might come alive at night, though Jenny shushed such talk with a nervous laugh. Soon, louder incidents commanded attention. One afternoon, as the family sat together in the lounge, the head with the witch face suddenly lifted off the table on its own, as if an invisible hand had seized it, and then hurled itself across the room. It smashed against the wall, dropping to the floor with a heavy thud. The Robsons leapt up in alarm. The head didn't shatter. It was remarkably solid. But a deep silence fell as they all stared at the innocuous-looking stone object, now lying on the floor. There was no explanation anyone can offer. No one had been near it. Poltergeist. The word wasn't spoken, but it hung uncomfortably in the air that evening, and the phenomena only grew stranger. Night after night, around 2:30 a.m., the household would be jolted awake by disturbances. A bitter shattering of glass echoed through the dark in the small hours. Rushing towards the sound, Jenny discovered that glass bottles in the kitchen had exploded, spraying shards everywhere with no discernible cause. Other objects began to move and fall with alarming spontaneity. Mirrors cracked mysteriously. On one occasion, the broken glass of a hand mirror was found neatly collected inside a cooking pot on the stove, as if carefully placed there by unseen hands. The children were frightened. Even Jenny, striving to remain the rational mother, felt a chill of dread creep into her bones as these incidents mounted. One of the Robson daughters, the family had more children than just Colin and Leslie, an older married daughter and at least one younger daughter still at home, experienced perhaps the most unnerving incident. Late one night, this youngest daughter woke up screaming in her bed. Jenny and her husband burst into the room to find the girl trembling in terror. And to their horror, they saw her bed was littered with shards of broken glass, spread in a rough circle around the mattress. It was as if the glass had been deliberately arranged in some ritual pattern. How had it gotten there? The window was intact. Nothing in the room was broken. The poor girl was so distraught that she refused to sleep in that bedroom afterward. Jenny comforted her child, her heart pounding with the realization that something truly unholy seemed to have invaded their home. Even the family pet was not untouched by the strangeness. The Robsons had a little pet budgerigar named Sparky, who brought cheer with its chatter. Around the time the Heads arrived, Sparky was found dead in its cage without any clear reason, a tiny, tragic loss that the family quietly buried in a corner of the garden. In the weeks that followed, an otherworldly rumor sprouted. A small glowing bush grew up from the soil right above Sparky's grave, giving off an eerie luminescence at night. Colin later recalled that the bush appeared exactly where the stone heads had been unearthed, and indeed, it seemed to produce its own light in the darkness. To the frightened family, even the garden now held a supernatural tinge, as if the earth itself was reacting to the head's disturbance. Inside the house, the pattern of inexplicable sounds continued. The family would hear a sudden whiplash crack in the air, often emanating from behind the television set. A single sharp snap that set their nerves on edge. Night after night, 2:30 a.m. became the hour of dread when these energies were most active. Jenny Robson found herself exhausted and anxious, sleeping lightly with one ear open for the next crash or footsteps in the dark. The two once harmless stone curiosities now seemed to exude a palpable energy that permeated the whole house. It felt like those heads had taken over. One family member would later say, an oppressive atmosphere settled over the furniture and walls, as if the very air was charged with something unnatural. Jenny Robson was a pragmatic woman, but the safety of her children came first. By now, she strongly suspected that the Hexham Heads, as the local papers were starting to call the carved faces, were at the root of these disturbances. Her sons Colin and Leslie, though thrilled at first by the novelty of their discovery, were now just as spooked as she was. Colin, in particular, would later admit that holding the heads made his hand tingle with a strange sensation, and that he had experienced other paranormal events in life, as if he were sensitive to such things. The boys no longer begged to keep the heads as souvenirs. They wanted whatever this was to stop. Jenny resolved to seek help. If the heads were some kind of ancient objects, maybe even cursed, then experts should examine them, or perhaps a clergyman should be called to bless the house. Either way, the Robsons needed relief from the nightly terror. Little did Jenny know, the problem was about to cross the walls into the neighbors' lives as well, taking an even darker turn. Chapter 2. The Were-Creature Next Door. The Robsons' next-door neighbor at number 1 Rede Avenue was Mrs. Ellen Dodd, known to her friends as Nellie Dodd, a kind-hearted woman and mother of a large family. Nellie and her husband Isaac Dodd had lived in that house for decades, raising several children of their own. By 1971, some of the Dodd children were grown and gone. One daughter, Sylvia, had married. An older son, Brian, ran the local Sun Inn pub. But a few younger ones were still at home. Trevor, a teenage son, and daughters Marie and Carol. Lively kids who often played with the Robson boys. The Dodds were a close-knit brood, and Nellie was the sort of practical, no-nonsense mother who didn't scare easily. Yet the events about to unfold in her home would leave even this sturdy matriarch shaken to the core. One winter night, not long after the Robson boys found the heads, Marie Dodd came down with a bad ear infection. The little girl was feverish and restless, unable to sleep from the ache in her ear. As any caring mother would, Nellie decided to spend the night in Marie's room to comfort her ailing child. She tucked Marie into bed and lay down beside her in the dark, occasionally stroking the girl's hair and whispering that everything would be all right. The household was quiet. Isaac Dodd slept down the hall, the other children in their rooms. Outside, an icy stillness blanketed the street. Marie kept fidgeting, half delirious with fever. At one point, she whimpered that something was touching her, brushing past her legs under the covers, as if a cat or a dog had jumped on the bed. Nellie gently assured her it was only a dream, or the fever talking. After all, they had no pet in the room. She might have attributed it to muscle aches or a child's vivid imagination. When Marie finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, Nellie turned off the bedside lamp and lay in the darkness beside her, listening to the tick of the hall clock. The mother must have been on edge from her daughter's strange complaint, but nothing in her experience could have prepared her for what happened next. Sometime after 2 a.m., Nellie Dodd found herself suddenly inexplicably awake. The bedroom was pitch black, silent, yet something had disturbed her, a movement, a presence. Blinking, she peered into the darkness. There, across the room, a shape was moving on all fours. At first she thought it might be Trevor sleepwalking on hands and knees, or perhaps a stray dog that somehow got in. But as her eyes adjusted, Nellie realized with dawning horror that this intruder was far from human and far from any ordinary animal. It was half man, half beast, its form black against the pale outline of the doorway. The creature's upper body was like a large wolf, with a shaggy head and pointed ears. The lower body seemed vaguely human, hunched and crawling. Its eyes glinted faintly. Nellie's heart hammered as the thing crept towards the bed. She lay paralyzed, scarcely breathing, while beside her Marie slept fitfully unaware. The monstrous hybrid brushed right up against Nellie and her daughter. She could feel the coarse touch of fur and the weight of a powerful body pressing the mattress down. In the darkness, the terrified mother dared not move. As suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned away and padded out of the bedroom, heading down the stairs with a heavy, thudding gait, as if on its hind legs. The moment it vanished from sight, Nellie found her voice and screamed in mortal fright, rousing the household with her cries. Isaac Dodd came running to find his wife white-faced and trembling, clutching little Marie, who was now awake and wailing in confusion. Through gasps, Nellie managed to describe what she had seen: a half-sheep, half-human creature, a bizarre were-sheep, crawling in the darkness of the children's room. Isaac was skeptical at first, until he saw the unmistakable terror in his wife's eyes. He checked the house. The doors were still locked, no sign of an intruder, but a faint odor of wild animal hung in the stairwell. It was as if a wolf had indeed passed through. News of the Dodd family's midnight visitation spread quickly through Hexham. Neighbors murmured about the Wolf of Ellendale, recalling an old local tale of a wolf that terrorized the area in 1904, slaughtering sheep until it was supposedly killed by a train. But this was something even more outlandish: a wolf-like specter right inside a family's home. The local press eagerly picked up the story of the Hexham Heads and the alleged werewolf or were-sheep connected to them. In a 1972 Tyneside newspaper interview, Mrs. Dodd recounted her horrifying encounter to a stunned public. The notion that two little stone heads could somehow conjure a shape-shifting beast was pure folk horror, but many believed it. After all, numerous witnesses, the Robsons and Dodds, had now experienced inexplicable events. The Dodds, utterly unnerved, did not want to see if the creature returned. Nellie Dodd moved her family out of 1 Rede Avenue soon after, urgently applying for a new council house far from this accursed address. One can hardly blame her. The home she had made warm and safe for decades was now tainted by an unimaginable nightmare. The Robson family, witnessing their neighbors flee in fear, felt a renewed urgency. For Jenny Robson, this was the final straw. The Heads had to go. Whatever uncanny power these objects possessed, she needed them out of her home and far away from her children. In the folklore of the British Isles, a common remedy for cursed objects is to hand them over to the church or to learned men who might neutralize their effects. Jenny wasn't particularly superstitious, but she was desperate, so one brisk morning she wrapped the 2 stone heads in a shoebox and took them to the one venerable place she could think of in Hexham that might help, the local Abbey. Chapter 3. Enter the experts from Abbey to academia. Hexham Abbey, with its ancient medieval halls and relics, had stood for centuries as a repository of history and faith. Jenny carried the heads through the Abbey's great doors and presented them to Betty Gibson, a longtime guide at the Abbey who was knowledgeable about local antiquities. Betty listened in astonishment as Jenny haltingly explained how her young sons had found the carved heads and how bizarre happenings followed. No exorcism was performed that day, but Betty Gibson recognized that these objects should be examined by professionals. She temporarily took custody of the heads, which, resting in the Abbey's cloister, seemed to behave themselves, and soon passed them on to someone with archaeological expertise. The heads next came into the hands of Professor Richard Bailey, an archaeologist associated with Newcastle University's Museum of Antiquities. Professor Bailey was an expert in Anglo-Saxon stone sculptures and ancient relics, and he must have raised a scholarly eyebrow at the crude little faces from Hexham. By now, whispers of the head's supposed curse and the Hexham werewolf had spread, but the academic experts were, for the most part, unruffled. To them, the Hexham heads were interesting artifacts requiring identification, not necessarily supernatural objects. Indeed, Roger Mikett, an archaeologist and the assistant keeper at the museum, would later describe the heads dryly as just archaeological material. It was as though these seasoned professionals refused to be drawn into the hysteria. They focused instead on the physical mystery of what the heads were made of and where and when they might have come from. Under Professor Bailey's direction, the heads were catalogued and examined at the museum. Barbara Harbottle, a respected archaeologist and educator, also took part in the assessment. Initially, there was a thought that the heads might be of genuine antiquity. After all, northern England had yielded carved stone heads before. Objects associated with the Celtic Iron Age or Romano-British period were sometimes dug up in fields and gardens. The Hexham heads, though small and peculiar, could perhaps be another example of that tradition. They were certainly weathered-looking and odd enough to be ancient cult objects. The museum team decided to send detailed drawings and photographs to a leading authority on Celtic artifacts, hoping for a more expert opinion. That authority was Dr. Anne Ross, and her arrival would inject the Hexham Head saga with a new intensity and a new victim of its eerie influence. Chapter 4. Dr. Anne Ross, scholar of Celtic myth and mystery Not long after the heads were safely in the museum's keeping, Dr. Ann Ross received a package at her office in Southampton. Inside were photographs, sketches, and notes detailing two unusual stone heads found in Hexham. Ann Ross was intrigued from the very first glance. At the time, Dr. Ross was one of Britain's foremost scholar of Celtic archaeology and folklore, a lecturer at the University of Southampton, and author of influential books on Celtic religion. In her mid-40s, Ann Ross had already made a name for herself with works like Pagan Celtic Britain, 1967, and The Pagan Celts. Her academic focus was the spiritual and artistic world of the ancient Celts, particularly their veneration of the human head. Dr. Ross believed that in Celtic culture, the human head held profound symbolic power. The human head was regarded by the Celts as being symbolic of divinity and otherworld powers, she wrote in one study. This long-standing fascination with the cult of the head meant that the moment Ann Ross saw the images of the Hexham Heads, her scholarly curiosity was aflamed. Where others saw crude little curios, Ross saw a potential link to ancient ritual. It would be fair to describe Dr. Ross as an eccentric scholar. Colleagues knew her as brilliant and passionate, but also someone who entertained ideas that more skeptical academics might frown upon. She straddled multiple disciplines: archaeology, history, folklore, and wasn't afraid to discuss mystical or paranormal aspects of ancient beliefs. Ross had a warm personality and a keen intuition, the kind of researcher who followed her gut as much as she did the data. And in the Hexham Heads, her gut sensed something extraordinary. She wrote back eagerly to the Newcastle Museum. She would love to examine the heads in person. As luck would have it, Dr. Ross was due to travel north soon to give a lecture in Newcastle. Plans were made. In early 1972, Ann Ross traveled to Newcastle and met with Roger Mikett to inspect the Hexham Heads. She turned the stone faces over in her hands, peered at their strange features, and felt a distinct thrill. Convinced at first sight that these were authentic Celtic cult objects, Ross went so far as to speculate that the find spot, the Robson's Garden at 3 Rede Avenue, might have been the site of an old Celtic shrine or sacred place. Perhaps, she mused, the heads had once been buried as offerings or protective charm in antiquity, only to be unearthed now by chance. The dramatic folklore swirling around the heads, the poltergeist activity, and the were-sheep sighting did not deter Ross. In fact, she found it compelling. To her, such phenomena fit with the notion of cursed objects awakening dark forces. Here, it seemed, was a case where her intellectual theories about Celtic relics intersected with living folklore. She decided to fully immerse herself in the investigation. During that Newcastle visit, Dr. Ross even met briefly with Mrs. Nellie Dodd, hoping to hear firsthand about the creature in her house. By reaching out to eyewitness and courting media attention, Ross signaled that she took the supernatural claims seriously. According to journalist Paul Screeton, Dr. Ross may have even tipped off the press that she would be examining the heads and inquiring about the were-sheep, a canny way to boost interest in what might otherwise have been a dry academic lecture. If so, the tactic worked. Soon, local newspapers carried headlines like "Terror from the Celtic Mists" and reported that Dr. Ann Ross believed a Celtic curse was afoot, and that she was considering excavating the garden at Rede Avenue to search for more clues. Though she ultimately never dug up the Robsons' yard, Ross's involvement added intellectual legitimacy to the Hexham Head mystery. It was no longer just a ghost story. It was potentially a discovery of historical significance. In the spring of 1973, Ann Ross published a scholarly article titled "Some New Thoughts on Old Heads" in the venerable journal Archaeological. In it, she described the two Hexham Heads and placed them alongside other carved stone heads found near Hadrian's Wall, suggesting they could be Romano-British religious objects. The article included precise illustrations of the heads drawn to proper archaeological conventions, and noted their archaic appearance in the context of their discovery. Admittedly, calling a modern suburban flowerbed a context verging on evidence of antiquity was a stretch, but Ross argued that if 3 Rede Avenue had once been a pagan sacred site, the heads being found there would be in accordance with an early date. In a footnote, she mentioned a preliminary petrological analysis by Professor Frank Hodson, a geologist at Southampton, which identified the head's material as a type of coarse sandstone, possibly local to the Hexham area. All these academic trappings gave the Hexham Heads an aura of credibility as possible artifacts. Dr. Ross, by virtue of her expertise, essentially proclaimed they might indeed be ancient. However, even in that paper, she cautiously acknowledged uncertainty about origin and date. And behind the scenes, Ann Ross had begun to experience events that would push her beyond the role of detached researcher into the role of frightened participant. After her Newcastle trip, Ross had brought the Hexham Heads back down south with her for further examination at Southampton University. She temporarily kept the heads at her family home in Bevis Mount, Southampton, an old house on Rose Road where she lived with her husband and children. The Ross household was learned and lively. Anne's husband, Richard Feacham, was himself an archaeologist, at one point styling his name as Richard the Feacham to echo ancient lineage. They had a teenage daughter, Berenice, and a slightly older son, Richard Jr., often called Charles. One imagines the children were used to their mother bringing home Celtic curiosities, bits of carvings, maybe even replica heads, and thought little of the 2 odd stone faces that arrived in 1973. But what followed in the Ross home turned this quaint academic scene into something like a chapter from a Gothic novel. It was a few days after Dr. Ross placed the Hexham Heads in her study at home that the werewolf came. in the dead of night, Anne Ross was asleep in her bed when a jolt of fear brought her awake at around 2 a.m. She felt an icy chill and sensed an evil presence. Sitting up, she saw in the dim light of her bedroom doorway a dark figure looming, about 6 feet high, slightly stooping, she later recounted, black against the white door, half animal and half man. Her heart leapt into her throat. The upper part of the figure was like a great wolf, with fierce eyes and a long snout. The lower part was humanoid, covered in coarse black fur. It was exactly the kind of apparition one might expect from Celtic legend, a were creature stepping straight out of the other world. The creature paused, locking eyes with Dr. Ross, then turned and moved away. Overcoming her terror with a surge of adrenaline, Anne sprang from bed and chased after the entity. An uncharacteristic reaction for a scholar, but as she said later, something made me run after it. I felt compelled. She could hear its heavy footfalls heading down the staircase. By the time she reached the landing, the beast was gone, vanished into the shadows, toward the back of the house, or perhaps into another realm. The house was silent once more. Shaken, Anne Ross realized this was no ordinary nightmare. She was convinced that the Hexham Heads had somehow drawn this werewolf-like specter to her home, just as they had, she believed, summoned the were-sheep in Hexham. The experience rattled her deeply, yet she did not immediately part with the heads. Perhaps her scientific curiosity mingled with a kind of defiance. She wanted to understand, to conquer whatever this was. However, the entity was not finished with the Ross family. Not long after Anne's encounter, her daughter Berenice Beecham came home from school one afternoon to an eerily quiet house. As Berenice stepped into the entry hall, she froze. There, on the staircase, she glimpsed a large black shape bounding down the steps. In an instant, the creature vaulted over the banister, landing with a heavy padded thud on the floor before rushing out through the back of the house. Berenice was left in a state of shell-shocked terror, huddled and trembling by the time her parents came home to find her. It was the exact same manifestation Anne had seen, a werebeast intruding upon their domestic space in broad daylight. For Anne Ross, this was the breaking point. The scholar who had spent her life studying Celtic lore suddenly found herself living it, and it was a nightmare. Without a moment's hesitation, Dr. Ross removed not just the Hexham Heads, but her entire collection of carved heads and occult objects from the house. The once beloved artifacts of Celtic culture had betrayed her, at least in her eyes, and she wanted no further part of them. I got rid of the whole lot, she later confessed. Better to live without those curios than to invite another supernatural visitation. One can imagine her carefully boxing up the Hexham Heads, those hot potatoes of archaeology, relieved to carry them out of her home for good. By 1974, Dr. Ross had passed the Hexham Heads along to a colleague for continued study, firmly closing that chapter of her life. Yet she did not stay silent about what had happened. In 1976, the bizarre tale of the stone heads and the were creature reached a national audience when BBC's television program Nationwide ran a feature on the Hexham Heads. On early evening TV, viewers across Britain saw the gray-haired, authoritative Dr. Anne Ross recounting how a werewolf invaded her Southampton home, seemingly drawn by two small stones. It was a sensational claim, one not typically heard from staid academics. Some of Ross's peers cringed, worried that this would tarnish her credibility. But others were captivated. The Hexham Heads were now front-page news in the world of paranormal, described in breathless media reports as evil objects too dangerous to handle. What had begun as children's discovery had become a full-blown modern legend, blending archaeology with ghost story. And still, the question remained, what were the Hexham Heads truly? Were they ancient or modern, cursed or coincidental? As the supernatural drama played out, scientists were quietly working to pin down the mundane truth, and they were coming to startling conflicting conclusions. Chapter 5: Tested and Contested. While Anne Ross and others were dealing with werewolves and whispers of Celtic curses, several scientists have been examining the Hexham Heads themselves in a much more earthbound manner. Their goal? Determine what material the heads were made of, and by extension, whether they were likely to be ancient artifacts or modern fakes. In what would become an infamous scientific head-to-head, two experts analyzed the stones and came up with completely different results, only adding to the mystery. The first analysis was done by Professor Frank Hodson, a geologist at Southampton University, where Dr. Ross taught. Professor Hodson was not only a respected geologist, but also the dean of the Faculty of Science there. He approached the Hexham Heads as he would any puzzling rock samples. Under a microscope, he inspected thin slices and surfaces of the heads. Hodson concluded that both heads were made from the same material, a very coarse sandstone with rounded quartz grains, likely quarried or occurring naturally in Britain. He even noted hints of a lime coating on the stone, and traces of red and yellow pigments, suggesting the heads might have once been painted or colored. Sandstone is, of course, a common material for ancient stone carvings in statuary. Hodson's verdict thus leaned toward the idea that the heads could be authentic relics carved from local stones. This aligned nicely with Dr. Ross's hopes. Indeed, it was Hodson's findings she cited in her Archaeologia Oleana article to back the archaic nature of the heads. At that point, many assumed the debate was settled. The Hexham Heads must be some kind of Celtic or Romano-British cult objects made of native stone and weathered by centuries underground. But then came a second opinion, one that would throw everything into doubt. The heads were also sent to Dr. Douglas Robson, a senior lecturer in geology at Newcastle University, not related to the Robson family of Hexham, despite the shared surname. Dr. D.A. Robson took a more aggressive approach in his analysis. Where Hodson had been content with visual and microscopic inspection, Douglas Robson opted to take a physical sample of the heads, likely grinding or chipping a small fragment for chemical analysis. His findings were unequivocal. The material from which the heads have been formed is an artificial cement, he reported, unlike any natural sandstone. In Dr. Robson's assessment, the heads were not carved from solid rocks at all, but rather cast or molded from some kind of concrete or mortar mixture. This was a bombshell. If the Hexham heads were made of concrete, they were almost certainly of recent origin, mid-20th century at the oldest, given the type of cement commonly used. Robson's test indicated the presence of modern binding compound in the absence of telltale natural minerals. Later accounts mentioned that a key component, like calcium silicate, found in real sandstone was lacking. In essence, Dr. Robson was calling the Hexham head a hoax, or at least a mistaken identity. Observers were baffled. How could two competent geologists look at the same objects, arrive at such opposite conclusions? Stone versus cement. Part of the answer lay in their methods. Hodson's was primarily a microscopic visual analysis, while Robson's was a chemical material analysis of an actual sample. Hodson had peered at the texture and seen grains that resembled sandstone, but Robson had physically broken down the material and found it was artificial. In hindsight, it appears Hodson may have been misled by the presence of real sand and quartz in the mixture, ingredients one might expect if someone made a cement using crushed stone. Without modern equipment or extensive testing, he presumed it was natural stone. Dr. Robson's more invasive approach yielded the more convincing result that the heads were composed of lime, sand, and possibly coal dust, typical of some kind of homebrew concrete. This scientific standoff was not just academic. It struck at the heart of the Hexham head mystery. If the heads were made in the 20th century, then all the talk of Celtic shrines and curses was built on a false premise. They would be nothing more than modern playthings, and any paranormal happenings would have to be chalked up to coincidence or psychological suggestion. But until the contradiction could be resolved, the Hexham heads straddled an uneasy line between artifact and artifice. By 1974 to 1975, it seems the museum in Newcastle was leaning towards Dr. Robson's view. They'd come to suspect the heads were not genuine antiquities, and thus were not inclined to keep them on exhibit. The Robson family, Colin and Leslie's mother Jenny, even wrote to the museum in 1975, asking for the heads to be returned to her sons if all the tests were done. A polite reply came from a museum official, stating that analysis was complete, the heads were indeed returned to the Robsons, and the file on the case was now closed. However, this official paper trail did not reflect the whole truth. As we'll soon see, the Heads apparently didn't actually make it back to the Robson boys in any straightforward way. Instead, they embarked on a more convoluted journey. But before that chapter unfolded, a local man stepped forward with a startling confession that, if true, solved the riddle of the Head's origin in one stroke. Chapter 6: Desmond Craigie's Claim. In March 1972, as the Hexham Heads saga was lighting up tabloids and intriguing investigators, an unassuming lorry driver named Desmond Craigie approached the press with a straightforward story. "I made them," he said, "about 16 years ago." To those enthralled by the notion of Celtic mysticism, Craigie's words were a splash of cold water. But Craigie, a down-to-earth man with a broad Northumbrian accent and a twinkle of amusement in his eye, this whole affair had been a source of quiet comedy. Desmond Des Craigie knew number 3 Rede Avenue well. In fact, he had lived in that very house for many years before the Robson family moved in. The Craigies had raised their own family there. Desmond's wife and children had called 3 Rede Avenue home up until the late 1960s, when the Robsons took tenancy. This timing neatly aligned with Craigie's claim that he'd made the Heads around 1956, roughly 16 years ago, from the early 70s. Why would someone create such odd little heads? Craigie explained that back in the 1950s, his young daughter Nancy had once asked him about his work. Desmond worked at an artificial stone casting plant, a factory that made concrete products. To show his curious child what he did all day, he decided to craft a tangible example. During his lunch break at the plant, using the same kind of material he worked with, likely a mix of crushed stone, sand, and cement, Des molded a few small round shapes and whittled faces onto them with a knife. In essence, he made toys for Nancy out of cast stone. According to Desmond Craigie's later recollection, he made not just 2 heads, but 3. The children played with them in the garden. One head got broken, perhaps cracked by rough play, and Craigie tossed the damaged one in the bin. The other 2, as he put it, just got kicked around in the yard over the years, and were eventually lost in the overgrowth. When he and his family moved out, those little cast stone heads likely remained somewhere in the dirt around the property. Fast forward to 1971. The Robson boys, digging in the garden, find the 2 remaining heads, and a grand mystery is born. It sounds perfectly plausible. Indeed, it explains why the heads were buried so shallowly and conveniently that 2 kids found them during casual play, a scenario far less likely if the heads had truly been lying there since the Iron Age. In a letter to the press, Craigie shared an endearing detail. She, Nancy, would use the silver paper from Penguin chocolate biscuit as eyes on the heads. One imagines little Nancy gleefully pressing foil candy wrapper into the eye socket of the crude faces that give them sparkling eyes, a far cry from Druidic ritual, but a charming scene of ordinary family life. When the story of the ghostly going-ons hit the newspaper, Desmond Craigie realized his long-lost handiwork immediately. He had at first watched the growing fervor with amusement, telling friends how hilarious it was that these old playthings were causing such a stir. "I have been laughing my head off about these heads," he quipped to a reporter, "and I cannot understand why all this attention is being paid to them." To Craigie, the notion that the heads were ancient Celtic relics or sources of a curse was absurd. They were made of cheap cement, for goodness sake. As the media frenzy continued, and experts debated the heads on national TV, Craigie finally decided to set the record straight publicly. In an interview with the Evening Chronicle, the local Newcastle paper, he confidently declared, "I definitely made them." He described the material, bits of stone and mortar, the time frame, mid-1950s, and even the fact that one head had gone missing long ago. To prove his claim, Craigie even went the extra mile. He crafted a couple of new stone heads in 1972 in front of journalists to show how easily it could be done. Photographs from that time show Craigie holding the newly made heads in his hands, their features crude and unrefined, honestly, even more amateurish than the originals. A side-by-side comparison was published, one of Craigie's fresh creations, next to a head that young Colin Robson himself had sculpted. Interestingly, Colin had tried making his own clay heads around the same time for a school project, producing a rather gruesome little face not unlike the ones he'd dig up later. These replica heads lacked the mysterious aura of the originals. They truly looked like rubbish imitations, which inadvertently lent credibility to the idea that the originals were perhaps a tad more skillful, or at least more weathered. Even so, most archaeologists and skeptics found Craigie's explanation entirely convincing. Here, at last, was a prosaic origin story that made sense. The Hexham Heads were nothing more than a quirky mid-century knick-knack that fell into the hands of imaginative children in superstitious minds. Yet, not everyone was satisfied. Believers in the head's mystery pointed out inconsistencies. For one, Professor Hodson's analysis had identified the heads as natural stone, not cement. Perhaps he was mistaken, or perhaps Craigie was lying. Some wondered if Craigie, enjoying a joke, had falsely taken credit for making the heads just to deflate the tale or inflate his own ego. Others thought the timing of his announcement was suspiciously convenient, coming just as the story was reaching a fever pitch. A few die-hard mystery lovers suggested that even if Craigie had made some heads, the ones found in the garden might be different, older ones, essentially proposing that Craigie's head and the Robsons' heads were not the same, though Craigie's intimate details about their location and number strongly argue they were. Craigie, for his part, faced a touch of ridicule. He had stepped forward to stop what he saw as nonsense, but enthusiasts and some locals were disappointed, even scornful of the lorry driver who spoiled the supernatural tale. In letters and forums, critics would deride him, implying his confession was a hoax of its own. Poor Desmond found that trying to play the adult in a situation driven by sensationalism was a thankless task. As one writer later noted, Craigie's attempt to clear the record was met with relentless second-guessing and a refusal by many to let a good spooky story die. Nonetheless, as the 1970s wore on, the consensus among investigators trended toward accepting Craigie's account. The conflicting scientific test, when re-examined, actually leaned in his favor. Dr. Douglas Robson's findings of artificial composition meshed perfectly with Craigie's narrative of a stone-cast origin. By 1977, many involved felt the Hexham Heads case was essentially solved. The heads were modern fakes, and the supernatural happenings were either coincidences or psychosomatic effects of suggestion. The museum certainly took that stance, which is why they quietly closed the file and showed no further interest. And so, one might think the story would end here, the Hexham Heads relegated to a footnote in the annals of Fortean curiosities. But the legend had taken on a life of its own, and a few threads remained unraveled. Most notably, where had the heads gone? If the Robson boys never actually got them back in hand, as some evidence suggests, who was the last to possess these notorious little objects? The trail leads us into a somewhat murky epilogue, involving a chemist with unconventional theories and a mysterious dowser who became the head's final custodian before they vanished entirely. Chapter 7. The Disappearance. By the mid-1970s, with dust settling from the Craigie revelation, one might imagine the Hexham Heads being quietly returned to the Robson family or stored away in a museum box. But the truth is more convoluted. The heads seem to have ping-ponged between institutions and researchers for a while, leaving a paper trail so confusing that later chroniclers had to sketch multiple possible timelines. One path, however, leads definitively to Gordon Don Robins. Don Robins was a British scientist, unlike any other involved in this case. By training, he was a material chemist and geologist. He even held a PhD, focusing on solid-state magnetic properties. But Robins was also deeply interested in what some might call Earth mysteries. He believed that ancient sites and objects could harbor latent energies or information. In 1988, he would publish The Secret Language of Stone, a book positing that certain mineral structures might record electrical or psychic imprints, essentially, that stones could talk in their own way. It was a fringe idea, blending science with the paranormal, and Don Robins was one of its chief architects. In the Hexham Heads, he saw a tantalizing opportunity. If these heads truly triggered poltergeist and werewolves, perhaps they held or channeled some kind of energy that could be measured or manipulated. Here was a chance to test his theories on a real-world mystery. In 1977, Don Robins' curiosity got the better of him. The Hexham Heads had been largely out of the limelight for a couple of years, but Robins arranged to examine them himself. He consulted with Dr. Ann Ross and even met with Professor Frank Hodson, likely at Southampton, to discuss the head's composition and the perplexing dual analyses. According to one account, Professor Hodson told Robbins during this meeting that he still doubted the heads were simple modern cement, noting the absence of certain cement additives in his earlier tests. In any case, the heads at that time were literally sitting in a little box in Hodson's office, as if waiting for someone to pay them attention again. Robbins took possession of the heads on the 21st of September 1977, as later documented by Paul Screeton. When he first handled them, Robbins felt an immediate and intense discomfort. He would later claim the heads exuded a presence, and that the female, or hag head in particular, seemed to be the focus of a malign influence. Robbins observed details others hadn't mentioned publicly. The boy head was heavy for its size, with greenish-gray stone and sparkling quartz, consistent with either natural stone or a dense aggregate. The girl head had a rougher texture, and intriguingly, Don Robbins noticed faint traces of yellow and red pigment on its top. Could it be that the heads had once been painted in bright colors? This was something even Anne Ross's earlier examinations hadn't highlighted. To Robbins, these pigments hinted at a deliberate artistic touch, ancient or modern. As he studied the heads, Robbins became convinced that they indeed retained some sort of paranormal power or residual energy, aligning with his hypotheses about artifacts carrying imprints. To unlock this supposed power, Robbins decided to employ the old art of dowsing, using a pendulum or rod to detect unseen energies. He wasn't a dowser himself, but he had contacts in the psychic research community. Robbins passed the Hexham Heads to a colleague known as Frank Hyde in February 1978, specifically for dowsing experiments. Frank Hyde is an enigmatic figure in this story, described as a gifted dowser and an amateur psychic. Mr. Hyde was actually by profession an astronomer and electrical engineer, an educated man with one foot in hard science and one in metaphysical pursuits. He lived in London, some sources say Camden, and had expressed interest in the Hexham case, likely through correspondence with Robbins or via the psychic circles. Robbins believed that Hyde, with his dowsing abilities, might be able to detect or awaken the forces within the heads. What happened next remains shrouded in rumor and fragmented accounts. Many believed that Frank Hyde was the last person to ever hold the Hexham Heads in his hands. After he took possession of them in 1978, the heads simply vanished from public view. One sensational anecdote claims that Frank Hyde suffered a devastating car accident while the heads were with him, and that he was never heard from again after that incident. It's said that the heads were in the vehicle during the crash, as if fulfilling a curse by bringing misfortune to their final keeper. Whether Hyde died or was merely incapacitated, or if this accident story is embellishment, remains unclear. But what's certain is that by the late 1970s, all attempts to trace the Hexham Heads hit a dead end. They were not returned to any museum or family. Hexham stone heads were gone, slipping into the shadow of legend. With the objects themselves missing, the Hexham Heads legend lingered on, unresolved yet undying. The local folklore of Hexham now firmly included the story of the two stone heads and the werewolf of Rede Avenue. In pubs around Northumberland, one might hear old-timers recount Nellie Dodd's fright, or gossip that the Wolf of Allendale had supernatural spawn in the 1970s. Meanwhile, in the realm of paranormal research, the Hexham Heads became a classic case study, a perfect cocktail of artifact and haunting that captured imaginations well beyond the region. Chapter 8: Legacy and Legend. As years passed, the tale of Hexham Heads and their eerie entourage of phenomena was kept alive thanks to a handful of dedicated writers and researchers. Chief among them was the man who perhaps knew the saga best, Paul Screeton, a journalist and folklorist. Screeton had been following the Hexham Heads almost from the start. In 1977, he personally traveled to Hexham to investigate, interviewing locals and collecting every scrap of information on the case. Screeton was a methodical and dogged researcher, albeit one with a taste for the Fortean and mystery. Over the decades, he amassed an archive of letters, newspaper clippings, and personal testimonies related to the Heads. In 1981, he self-published a crudely typed booklet titled Tales of the Hexham Heads, which was the first attempt to compile the full story in one place. That humble 60-pence pamphlet became a cornerstone for later researchers, and indeed, it formed the basis for Screeton's own much-expanded book, Quest for the Hexham Heads, published in 2012. Screeton's narrative style could meander. He loved tangents and colorful side stories, but his commitment to preserving the facts and ambiguities of the case made his work the definitive account. Thanks to him, future generations could read about Colin and Leslie's discovery, Dr. Ross's terror, and Des Craigie's confession, all in one comprehensive chronicle. It wasn't just the printed page that kept the story alive. In the 21st century, new media and researchers of a younger generation picked up the thread. Stuart Farrell, a Fortean writer and broadcaster, became fascinated by the Hexham Heads and delved into the mystery with fresh eyes. In 2012, 40 years after the heads were found, Farrell penned a 2-part article, In Search of the Hexham Heads, for Fortean Times magazine, in which he actually joined Paul Screeton on a pilgrimage back to Hexham. The two men retraced the steps of the saga. They visited Rede Avenue, peering over the hedge into the garden where a new family now lived, likely unaware of the weird history beneath their lawn, and they shared pints at a local pub while reminiscing on how the story had evolved. Farrell also sat down with Screeton in a Northumbrian pub for a feature aptly titled Headcase, a chat with Paul Screeton, picking the veteran researcher's brain about his long involvement with the case. Through such collaborations, the lore of the Hexham Heads was introduced to new audiences. Stuart Farrell brought not only a reverence for Screeton's work, but also an investigative zeal of his own. He sniffed out local rumors that had never made the papers, like a tantalizing explanation for Nellie Dodd's creature sighting. Farrell heard a story about a drunken butcher's apprentice who, on the very night of the Dodd incident, staggered home along Rede Avenue with a stolen sheep carcass slung over his back. To a half-awake person, this hunched figure with a dead sheep could indeed resemble a half-man, half-beast, prowling on all fours. It was an entirely plausible, if bizarre, rational explanation, one that would convert the Hexham werewolf back into merely the Wolf of Ellendale, in a very literal sense. Farrell included this account in his Fortean timepiece, giving readers a gentle reminder that even the strangest tales might have ordinary truths behind them. But as he acknowledged, regardless of what truly happened, the Hexham Heads had by then secured their place in Britain's rich collection of modern folk myths. The image of those evil little heads and the dark events associated with them continued to send shivers down spines, an enduring story to be retold around campfires and on paranormal podcasts. From time to time, whispers surface of someone trying to track down the missing heads. Theories abound. Perhaps they were thrown out with Frank Hyde's effects, now languishing in a landfill. Maybe they sit in an unopened evidence box in some council storage. One whimsical notion even suggests they might have been quietly reburied in Hexham soil, returning to whatever rest they came from. So far, all searches have been in vain. The heads remain lost as of this writing, their whereabouts one more enigma layered onto the tale. A dedicated blog run by enthusiasts meticulously charts possible custody sequences and dead ends in the hunt for the heads, but even they conclude that it doesn't look like they'll be found anytime soon. And perhaps that's as it should be. The Hexham Heads feel like a story that wants to remain unresolved, suspended between worlds. On one hand, we have the prosaic explanation. They were Desmond Craigie's youthful craft project, nothing more. And the rest was overactive imagination and coincidence. On the other hand, the string of eerie occurrences, the poltergeist outbreak, the glowing garden bush, the apparition in two separate houses, suggests a pattern too specific to dismiss so easily. Maybe, as some paranormal theorists propose, even a modern object can become a focus for psychic energy under the right conditions. Perhaps the intense emotions and attention given to the heads charge them like batteries, fulfilling Don Robin's idea in a roundabout way. Or maybe the heads simply acted as a catalyst for latent sensitivities in people like young Colin, who later admitted he had a knack for sensing spirits, and Dr. Ross, whose deep immersion in Celtic mysticism might have made her susceptible to visionary experiences. In the end, the Hexham Heads legend invites both skepticism and belief in equal measure, and that is the secret to its longevity. In Hexham today, you might find a few older residents who remember the commotion of the 1970s, the TV news crew that came to film the haunted house, or the chatter at the marketplace about werewolves on the loose. The Hexham Courant recently revisited the tale as a Halloween feature, reminding locals that their town once grappled with a real-life folk horror story. The article wove together the old 1904 wolf scare with the 1970s Heads phenomenon, cleverly suggesting that perhaps the spirit of the wolf still roamed Hexham's moors, if not in body, then in legend. It's now part of the cultural heritage of the area, a strange point of pride that Hexham can lay claim to one of the eeriest stories in England. As a sleepy Northumbrian town settles into another quiet night, one can imagine that somewhere, perhaps beneath the earth or tucked in a forgotten attic chest, the two stone heads rest. In the mind's eye, they appear as they did in that famous photograph, small enough to sit in a man's palm, yet with those sharply defined features that seem to hold a slight wisdom. Are they evil? Probably not. Are they ancient? Likely not. But they are entirely unique, having inspired a chain of experiences and narratives that blur the line between reality and imagination. And so, the Hexham Heads leave us with a lasting image. Two crude faces peering out of the darkness of time. Perhaps they are laughing at the grand hullabaloo raised over a child's toy, or perhaps they are gazing, unblinking, towards that corner of the garden under the moonlight, the place where they first saw the sky after centuries buried, waiting patiently for the next unsuspecting soul to dig 'em up and start the story anew. The final truth of the Hexham Heads may remain hidden, but their tale continues to captivate and unsettle a modern myth in the making. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere out there, a pair of stone eyes might still be glinting in the dark, keeping their secrets until the time is right to resurface. Only time will tell if the Hexham Heads will ever speak again, or if their legends are all that remain, echoes of an average day in an average town that became anything but average once the Stoneheads came out of the ground.